Alright, so in this video, we are going to talk about how the human heart develops. Now, the heart is actually the first functional organ to develop in the embryo. And the reason is because during the first 2 weeks of development, the embryo is very small, so oxygen and nutrients can simply diffuse from the mother. But by the third week, diffusion is no longer enough to support the nutritional and oxygen requirements of the embryo. And because the embryo is growing rapidly. Okay, so therefore the need for a circulatory system. Okay? Now, during gastrulation, the embryo forms three germ layers, which is the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. Now, the one on blue is the ectoderm. So this one on red is the mesoderm, while this yellow one is the endoderm. Now, the mesoderm differentiates into the parietal mesoderm, the intermediate mesoderm, and the lateral plate mesoderm. The lateral plate mesoderm further differentiates into the somatic mesoderm or somatopleuric mesoderm and the splanchnic mesoderm or splanchnopluric mesoderm. Okay. Now the heart develops from the splanchnic mesoderm of the embryo. Now around day 16 to 18 of development, around days 16 to 18, cells in the splanchnic mesoderm at the cranial end of the embryo begins to specialize. So these cells are called cardiac progenitor cells, are called cardiac progenitor cells. Okay, so they aggregate to form a horseshoe-shaped region known as the cardiogenic area. All right, so this is the cardiogenic area. So in this diagram, we can see the position of the cardiogenic area in relation to the developing brain. So this is the developing brain. So you can see that the cardiogenic area is cranial to the developing brain. Okay, so that's the developing heart is actually above the developing brain at this stage of development. Okay, so within the cardiogenic area, clusters of mesodermal cells differentiate into angioblasts. Okay, and these angioblasts organize themselves into solid cellular strands called angioblastic cords. Okay, so at this point, they are solid without a lumen, but eventually they canalize or they undergo the process of canalization, and eventually they develop a lumen. They become a hollow structure. Now have two endothelial heart tubes, one on the left side and one on the right side. Okay? So the heart tubes are something like this. All right. So at this point, we now have two endothelial heart tubes. Okay. Now the embryo does not remain a flat sheet. It actually undergoes two types of folding. You have the craniocaudal folding or the head tail folding. The craniocaudal, cranial, caudal folding and the lateral folding. Now let's talk about the folding of the head part of the embryo. Now, as the brain grows, the embryo folds forward. Okay, it folds forward. So the tubes now move from above the head to a position ventral to the foregut. Now let's see an image to show us this. Okay, so the brain grows and the embryo folds forward. Okay, as you can see in this diagram. Now this head folding moves the heart tube into the chest region, into the thoracic region. Okay, and in a position that is ventral or in front of the foregut. Now this is the foregut, this is the heart tube. Okay, and this is the pericardial cavity. All right. Now, almost at the same time, the embryo undergoes lateral folding. Okay, as I said. Now, lateral folding is also called side-to-side folding. So apart from the craniocaudal folding, the embryo also undergo side-to-side folding. Okay. Now, this image illustrates the side-to-side folding of the embryo. Now, as the embryo folds, this movement brings the two endothelial heart tubes towards the midline, and eventually the endothelial heart tubes fuse to become a single primitive heart tube. Now, let's look at the relationship of the heart tubes to the pericardial cavity. Okay. Now, the heart develops from the splenopleural mesoderm, and now due to head folding, the heart tube comes to a position that is in front of the foregut. Okay. And here we have the pericardial cavity. And in this diagram, due to lateral folding, the two heart tubes fuse together and become a single primitive heart tube. Okay. And this single primitive heart tube is an endothelial tube. And the inner lining of this tube will become the endocardium of the heart, which is the smooth lining of the adult heart chambers. Okay. Now, as the heart pushes into the pericardial sac, the mesoderm lining the dorsal side of this pericardial cavity wraps completely around the tube, just like this. This is the heart tube. Now, this mesodermal part that is lining the dorsal side of the pericardial cavity wraps completely around the tube, like this. Now, this part of the mesoderm is the splenopleural mesoderm. Okay, and it thickens to form the myoepicardial mantle. And this myoepicardial mantle will give rise to two major layers. First, the myocardium, which is the cardiac muscle, and then the epicardium, which is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Okay, now let's talk about the outer layer. We've talked about this mesodermal We've talked about this mesodermal layer that wraps the heart tubes completely. Now let's talk about the outer layer. The outer layer or the outer wall is from the somatopleuric mesoderm, and it forms the parietal layer of the serous pericardium, along with the tough outer fibrous pericardium. Okay, so putting this together, you now have the visceral layer and the parietal layer. Okay, and between these two layers is the pericardial cavity. Now, at this point, even as the heart tube, around day 22 or thereabout, at the beginning of the fourth week, the heart is said to start beating. So in this diagram, you can see the two heart tubes and the two heart tubes eventually fuse together to become a primitive heart tube. Okay. Now, as this heart tube grows, it forms dilatations or swellings. Okay, as this image shows. Now, in this tube, this is the venous end, while this is the arterial end, and blood flows in this direction. All right. Now let's look at the parts of the heart tube and their adult derivatives. Okay. So this part of the heart tube is called the sinus venosus. Sinus venosus. Now it is the lowest part of the heart tube and it receives venous blood. Okay. It has a central body. So this is the central body and a right and left horn. Now, in the adult heart, the right horn enlarges and becomes the smooth posterior part of the right atrium, okay, which is the sinus venarum. Okay, so the right horn becomes the sinus venarum, right, which is the smooth posterior wall of the right atrium. Now, the left horn regresses and becomes the coronary sinus. Okay, so the left horn, it regresses, okay, and becomes the coronary sinus. Okay, now this part in blue is the primitive atrium. The primitive atrium. So the primitive atrium forms the rough trabeculated parts of both the right and left atria. So it forms the rough or trabeculated parts of both the right and left atria. Now this part is called the primitive ventricle. Now the primitive ventricle forms the trabeculated part of the left ventricle. Now this part is called the bulbus cordis. The bulbus cordis. Now the proximal part of the bulbus cordis forms the trabeculated part of the right ventricle. Trabeculated part of right ventricle. Now the middle part of the bulbus cordis, which is also called the conus cordis, it forms the outflow tracts of the right and left ventricle. Outflow tracts of the ventricles, both right and left. Okay. Now the distal part of the bulbus cordis is called the truncus arteriosus. The truncus arteriosus, and it forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. It forms the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Okay. Now these are the derivatives of the heart tube. Now the next thing we'll talk about is cardiac looping. Okay. Now, it's very important to note that at this point, the heart tube is growing rapidly, okay, but it is anchored to both ends. And here we have the septum transversum, the septum transversum, which eventually becomes the central tendon of the diaphragm. Okay, so what happens is that the heart tube begins to bend because it can no longer fit properly into the pericardial cavity. So it has to, bend to fit in. All right, so this picture shows the heart tube in a horizontal position. So let's turn it, let's see a vertical position of this picture to understand what's going on. Okay, so the heart tube has to bend in order to fit into the pericardial cavity. Now, the bulbous cordis and the primitive ventricles bend forward and to the right. Okay, the bulbous cordis and the primitive ventricle bend forward and to the right, while the primitive atrium and the sinus venosus move backwards and upwards, okay, as this diagram illustrates. Now, at this point, the heart now has an S shape, and it um, is this cardiac looping or cardiac folding that establishes the definitive adult shape of the heart. Okay, so now this image shows how the heart eventually forms from the S shape. It eventually forms the definitive adult shape. Okay, now the next thing we'll talk about is septation of the heart. Okay, building the walls of the heart. Now at this point, even though the heart has transformed into its classic shape, but the inside is still a continuous tube. So between weeks 5 and 8 of development, the embryo, builds its internal walls. Okay, so the process of septation occurs. So we are going to look at how the atrioventricular canal is divided. We are going to look at how the primitive atrium is partitioned into the left and the right atria. Okay, we're also going to look at how the primitive ventricle is partitioned or divided into the left and right ventricle. Now let's look at the division of the atrioventricular canal. Okay. Now initially in our primitive heart tube, between the primitive ventricle and the primitive atrium is the AV canal or atrioventricular canal. So what happens is that two swellings called the endocardial cushions grows, one from the back, which is called the dorsal atrioventricular cushions, and one from the front, which is called the ventral atrioventricular cushions. Okay, so we have taken a transverse section of this AV canal. So we have something like this. Okay, so we have the dorsal AV cushions and the ventral AV cushions. So they eventually fuse, okay, to form the septum intermedium. They fuse to form what is called the septum intermedium. Now, so the single atrioventricular canal is now divided into the left opening and the right opening. Okay, so this will eventually lead to the formation of the tricuspid and mitral valves. Okay, now let's talk about the formation or partitioning of the atria. So, in the formation of the atrial septation or the atrial division, at first, a septum, which is called the septum primum, grows from above downwards, and it eventually forms an opening called the foramen primum. Okay, so the septum grows from above, and eventually it leaves out a space called a foramen primum. So the Septum primum continues eventually, it will continue growing to cover this foramen primum. Okay, but before this foramen primum is closed, another foramen is opened at the top here, which is called the foramen secundum, as this diagram shows us. Okay, so we have seen that the the septum primum eventually will grow and close off this foramen primum. Okay, but before the foramen primum is closed off, due to apoptosis, another foramen is opened up here, which is called the foramen secundum. Now, another septum starts growing from the right side of the septum primum. So this septum is called the septum secundum. Okay, so it keeps growing and eventually overlaps the septum primum here. Okay, so this is the septum primum, and this is the septum secundum. Okay, now the septum secundum partially overlaps the septum primum and leaves out a space, an opening called the foramen ovale. So due to this foramen ovale, blood flows from the right part of the atrium to the left part of the atrium. Okay, so this is the right atrium and this is the left atrium. All right, now let's look at how the primitive ventricle is partitioned. Now, in the septation of the ventricles, now three components must meet. So they are the muscular septum, the bulbar septum, and the membranous septum. Okay, so in this diagram, we have a longitudinal section to show us the ventricular septation. So this is the atrium, and this is the ventricle. Okay, so we have a longitudinal section showing the ventricles. Okay, so we said that three components must meet. So we have the muscular septum that is growing upwards. So this muscular septum grows upwards and it's called the interventricular septum. So it eventually forms a space called the interventricular foramen. Okay, so another septum grows from upwards down and it's called the bulbar septum. Okay, now the membranous septum is formed from the aviculations and partly from the bulbar septum. Okay, so the aviculations proliferate, and with the bulbar septum, they eventually close the interventricular foramen. So this is essentially how the ventricles is divided into the left and the right ventricles. So we've come to the end of this video, and I hope you gained some value during the course of this video. Now, if you did, please kindly subscribe to the channel, right? And let me see your comments. Okay, so thank you so much for watching and see you in my next video.